She looked at me like she'd been waiting her whole life, and now I was finally the one. The first time I noticed her, it wasn't dramatic. She simply existed in the corner of the room, a quiet presence that somehow made the air feel warmer. There was a subtle confidence in the way she moved, graceful, measured, almost imperceptible, yet utterly magnetic. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but her energy drew people toward her. And somehow, she noticed me too, not with a glance that demanded attention, but one that quietly acknowledged me, as if recognizing a familiar note in a complex melody. It started with small, almost mundane interactions. The way she handed me a folder, her fingers brushing mine just long enough to send an electric spark through my veins. Or when she leaned slightly forward to explain something, the soft cadence of her voice threading itself into my thoughts long after she spoke. I caught myself lingering on these moments, replaying them in my head, trying to analyze why they made my chest tighten with anticipation. There was a warmth to her presence that was tangible. Even the faint scent she carried lingered, subtle yet intoxicating, like rain on warm earth. And her smile, oh, that smile, wasn't the kind that demanded reciprocation. It was softer, patient, as if she were letting the world catch up to her joy slowly, letting me inch closer without noticing. I found myself drawn to her, not only because she was beautiful in a way that transcended appearance, but because she seemed emotionally present in a manner that most people weren't. She noticed details, the crease in my shirt, the fatigue hidden behind my eyes, the quiet way I tried not to be noticed. And in those moments, I felt understood in a way I hadn't before, a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. There was also hesitation, mine mostly. The age difference hung over me like a quiet shadow. She was older, more experienced, more refined, and I felt the weight of that difference pressing against my chest every time I lingered too long on her expressions. And yet, her presence was neither intimidating nor overbearing. Instead, it encouraged me to step closer, to listen more, to simply exist beside her without pretense. That day, nothing happened that anyone would call remarkable. We exchanged words, smiles, and gestures that could have been interpreted as simple politeness. But to me, it felt like the beginning of something profound. Her eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. Her hand brushed mine without purpose yet with intent, and I realized that I was quietly, irrevocably drawn in. Something had shifted, though I couldn't yet name it. A slow, almost imperceptible pull toward her, one that promised the start of a connection deeper than either of us could anticipate. It was quiet, subtle, unassuming, but it was enough. And for some reason, I felt, even then, that she had been waiting for me, just as I had begun to wait for her, though neither of us knew it yet. After that first quiet encounter, I found myself noticing her everywhere, though it wasn't like she sought attention. It was the subtle way she appeared in my world. At the cafe I visited on rainy mornings, in a library aisle I usually wandered past, or passing by in the hallway, where our schedules collided by chance. And every time, our eyes met, even for a fraction of a second, and the world seemed to pause just long enough for me to feel her presence ripple through me. It wasn't flirtation. It was something quieter, something almost sacred. A brush of fingers as she handed me a notebook, her hand resting for a heartbeat on mine, sending an unfamiliar warmth coursing through my body. A subtle laugh shared over an inside joke, her eyes sparkling with mischief, yet holding a depth of understanding I didn't have words for. These were the moments that lingered long after they ended, replaying in my mind with an intensity one couldn't explain. I began noticing the small, intimate gestures that weren't words but spoke volumes. The way she tilted her head when she listened, leaning in just slightly, her hair falling across her shoulder in soft waves. The way she mirrored my movements unconsciously, sipping her coffee after I did, leaning on the same railing I gravitated toward. And when our hands brushed against each other in passing, it was almost electric, a fleeting connection that left me breathless, yet wanting more. But it wasn't one-sided. There were moments when I caught her looking at me, not with judgment or calculation, but with a quiet curiosity, a patience that both comforted and unnerved me. She seemed to sense my hesitation, my internal struggle with the age difference, my uncertainty about the possibility of this connection. And yet, she never pushed. Her presence alone was encouragement, her attention enough to make my chest tighten with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Every encounter seemed to stretch time. The clatter of the office, the hum of conversation, even the faint rustle of papers on a desk faded into the background whenever she was near. I noticed the subtle perfume she wore, a soft, lingering fragrance that somehow made every ordinary moment feel significant. And her voice, low, measured, and warm, seemed to wrap around my thoughts, settling into places I hadn't known needed comfort. There was tension, yes, a silent, almost unbearable tension that hummed in the spaces between words and touches. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, electric with the unspoken, full of possibility. I found myself craving those fleeting moments, the lightest touch on my arm, the lingering gaze across a crowded room, the quiet laughter shared in passing. It was intoxicating, yet restrained, the kind of tension that made ordinary life feel extraordinary. And in all of it, I began to realize something undeniable. I was drawn to her not only by attraction, but by the way she seemed to understand the parts of me I rarely let anyone see. Each glance, each brush of skin against skin, each pause filled with unspoken words was a promise, subtle, delicate, and entirely hers, that something far deeper was waiting just beneath the surface. It was one of those rainy evenings when the world outside seemed muted, softened by the steady drizzle that tapped against the windows. The office had emptied, leaving just the two of us, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only companion to our quiet. We were sitting across from each other, paperwork forgotten, caught in a conversation that had begun casually, but had slowly deepened into something unspoken yet heavy with meaning. She spoke softly, her voice careful, measured, yet carrying a fragility I hadn't noticed before. She told me about a moment from her past, a time when she had felt isolated despite being surrounded by people. The words came with hesitation, a subtle tremor in her hands as she fidgeted with the edge of a pen, and for the first time, I saw the quiet vulnerability behind her poised exterior. It was a side of her she didn't show often, a delicate honesty that made the air between us feel charged with intimacy. I leaned in slightly, conscious of the small space that separated us, aware of the warmth radiating from her, as if it were spilling into me. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, steady yet slightly uneven, and my instinct was to reach out, to offer comfort without a word. My hand hovered near hers before settling on the desk, close enough for our fingers to brush occasionally, tentative and electric, a silent reassurance that I was listening, that I understood more than words could express. There was a pause in her story, a quiet hesitation where she searched my eyes for judgment or pity and found neither. Instead, she found patience, a willingness to simply be present with her. That pause stretched, and in that stretching, our connection deepened. The tension in the room was no longer about unspoken desire alone. It was about trust, about allowing another person to see the unguarded parts of you without fear. Her vulnerability drew me in, not in a possessive way, but with a longing to be worthy of the closeness she was offering. I noticed the slight quiver in her hands as she spoke, the way her shoulders relaxed when she exhaled deeply, the tiny catch in her voice that revealed she was letting me in, bit by bit. I realized then that the depth of her life experience, her strength, and her past sorrows were part of what made her magnetic. She carried herself with grace. Yet underneath, there was this human fragility that made her feel achingly real and achingly reachable at the same time. Without thinking, I reached a little closer, resting my hand gently near hers, letting our fingers occasionally brush. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted subtly, as if inviting the connection while still holding her dignity intact. That simple act, small and almost imperceptible, felt monumental. It was a promise of intimacy, the first real acknowledgement that we were no longer merely passing acquaintances, but two people daring to touch the edges of something meaningful. As she spoke, I realized that these moments, the quiet, the vulnerable, the fleeting touches, were laying the foundation for something far deeper than either of us had expected. And as I watched her, listening, feeling, I knew that the slow burn that had started in glances and fleeting touches was beginning to turn into a connection that could not be ignored. For the first time, I felt the unmistakable pull of not just attraction, but emotional intimacy, a connection that whispered possibilities I had only begun to imagine. The days that followed our quiet, vulnerable conversation were some of the most confusing I'd ever experienced. I found myself thinking about her constantly, replaying each detail, the tilt of her head when she listened, the soft cadence of her voice, the subtle warmth of her hand brushing mine. Every encounter, no matter how brief, seemed to leave a lingering echo inside me, a tug at a part of my heart I hadn't realized was waiting. But alongside that longing came hesitation, sharp and unavoidable. She was older, experienced, graceful in ways I wasn't sure I could match. And while I felt an undeniable pull toward her, there was a quiet voice in my head reminding me of boundaries, of expectations, of the social constructs that whispered this connection was unusual, even risky. I caught myself overthinking every interaction, analyzing every glance and every smile, wondering if I was misreading subtle signals or simply allowing desire to color reality. Yet, whenever I tried to step back, to distance myself, I noticed her presence in ways that were impossible to ignore. She didn't pressure me, never. Her gestures remained small but deliberate. A gentle touch on my forearm during conversation, a fleeting brush of her fingers as she passed by, the occasional lingering glance that seemed to say more than words ever could. It was almost maddening, this silent dance we were caught in, because each touch, each glance, left me more conflicted than the last. I began to realize that the hesitation wasn't only mine. There was a quiet patience in the way she approached me, a sensitivity to my internal struggle. She seemed to understand, intuitively, that I was wrestling with both desire and fear, and she allowed me space to navigate it at my own pace. That awareness made her feel even more alluring, even more emotionally magnetic. She wasn't chasing me. She was letting the connection breathe, letting it grow slowly, intentionally. The tension between us was no longer just curiosity or attraction. It had become a quiet, persistent ache. I noticed it in the way I subconsciously sought her in crowded rooms, in the moments I found excuses to linger near her, in the way my heartbeat spiked when her hand brushed mine accidentally, but deliberately. Every subtle interaction carried weight, and yet, the weight was not oppressive. It was alive, electric, full of possibility. Late at night, I'd replay our interactions over and over, wondering if I had the courage to allow myself to feel completely, to let the walls I had built around my emotions crumble in her presence. The age gap, the social expectations, my own uncertainty, they all pressed against me, yet they could not erase the undeniable pull I felt toward her. And in those quiet, conflicted moments, I began to understand something important. The heart doesn't measure age, experience, or logic. It only measures connection. It only measures presence. And hers was a presence I couldn't ignore, a quiet gravity pulling me closer with every fleeting touch, every lingering gaze. I knew that eventually I would have to face the fear and allow myself to step fully into whatever this was, because denying it felt impossible. It was a quiet evening, the kind that seems ordinary until the air itself holds a charge you can't ignore. The office was empty, the fluorescent lights casting soft shadows across the room. Outside, rain pattered gently against the windows, each drop a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. Somehow, it all felt like a stage set for the moment I've been both dreading and longing for, though I didn't yet know how close we were to it. We found ourselves sitting across from each other, the distance between us smaller than usual. Words came slowly, each sentence measured, yet heavy with the weight of everything left unspoken. I noticed the subtle movements she made, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight catch in her breath when she looked at me, the faint tremor in her hands as they rested on the table. Everything about her seemed magnified, every gesture loaded with quiet meaning. And then there was the moment when her gaze met mine, holding longer than I could comfortably sustain. It wasn't a glance. It was a conversation without words, a declaration without sound. I felt myself leaning in, drawn by a gravity I couldn't resist, though my mind raced with caution and anticipation. The tension between us was palpable, thickening the air until it was almost tangible. Every nerve in my body seemed to hum with awareness. Her presence, her proximity, the subtle brush of her sleeve against mine. She moved just slightly, close enough for our knees to brush, and the contact sent a shiver through me. I noticed how her eyes softened as they held mine, how her lips parted ever so slightly, as if she were about to say something that could change everything. And in that silence, filled only with the distant patter of rain, I realized how long I had been waiting for this, to be truly seen by her, to share this electric moment of recognition and longing. Her hand reached out, almost instinctively, resting gently on my arm. The touch was deliberate yet tender, a grounding presence that set my thoughts ablaze. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and I realized that this was no longer casual tension or subtle attraction. This was the moment where emotions collided, desire tempered by hesitation, longing tempered by restraint, hearts daring to speak what words could not. Time slowed. The world outside, the rain, the empty office, the hum of lights, faded into insignificance. There was only her and me, the space between us charged with possibilities, the unspoken confession hovering like a fragile thread waiting to be claimed. I could feel the warmth radiating from her hand, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the steady beat of her presence anchoring me in a way I hadn't anticipated. And then, almost like a whisper, she leaned ever so slightly closer, and our eyes locked with an intensity that made every earlier hesitation vanish. The unspoken acknowledgement was undeniable. Something profound had awakened between us. The slow burn of weeks of lingering glances and subtle touches reached its apex, not with words, not with declarations, but with the quiet understanding that what we felt was real, mutual, and undeniable. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside and the soft patter of rain against the windows. It felt like the world had contracted around us, leaving only the two of us suspended in a fragile, charged bubble of anticipation. I could feel my heart racing, every nerve taut with awareness of her presence, of the gravity that had been building for weeks now. There was no need for words yet, but the moment demanded them, demanded honesty, demanded vulnerability. She shifted slightly, closing the small space between us without breaking eye contact. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, but softened by a depth of emotion I hadn't fully allowed myself to anticipate. And then she spoke, the words that seemed to have been waiting for this moment all along, like a confession carried silently through months of glances and touches. I've wanted this longer than you could ever imagine. The sound of it, the way she said it, with a mix of certainty and gentle vulnerability, stopped me in my tracks. My breath caught, and for a moment, all the fear, hesitation, and self-doubt melted away. It was as though time had slowed, each syllable etching itself into my memory. I realized that everything I'd felt, every lingering glance, every brush of hands, every quiet, shared moment, was part of something real, something she had been feeling as deeply as I had. I wanted to speak, to respond, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, I let my hand hover near hers, almost instinctively, until our fingers found each other. The touch was tentative at first, careful, as if testing the reality of what we both now knew. And then she leaned closer, resting her cheek lightly against my shoulder, a soft warmth spreading through me. It was intimate, safe, and entirely filled with meaning. an embrace that spoke louder than any confession. The vulnerability in her eyes mirrored my own. I could see the courage it took for her to admit her feelings, the patience she had exercised in letting me navigate my own hesitation. And in that quiet, suspended space, I understood the depth of the connection we had been building. It wasn't just desire. It was trust. It was recognition. It was an emotional intimacy that went far beyond fleeting attraction. I responded in kind, letting the slow warmth of our closeness settle over me. My hand covered hers, our fingers intertwining with a natural, easy familiarity, and I felt the steady beat of her presence against me. No words were necessary. The confession had already been made, and the acceptance was mutual. Every lingering touch, every subtle smile, every quiet glance we had shared was now infused with purpose and acknowledgement. For the first time, the tension that had threaded through our interactions felt like release. The slow burn of weeks had transformed into a steady warmth, a promise that this connection, delicate and intense, was real and wanted by both of us. The moment was not just a confession, it was the beginning of something lasting, tender, and fully felt. And as I felt her hand in mine, her cheek against my shoulder, I realized that this was exactly where we were meant to be, together, quietly, completely, and without hesitation. The days that followed were quiet, ordinary in some ways, but infused with a new kind of warmth that neither of us had expected. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, unfolding rhythm of two people who had finally allowed themselves to feel fully, to exist openly in a connection that had been building for weeks. Every glance, every brush of hands, every subtle smile carried the weight of mutual understanding and the promise of something lasting. We began to find our rhythm in the small moments. A shared coffee in the morning became a ritual, the warmth of the cup between our hands mirrored by the warmth of our presence together. Sometimes our fingers would brush, sometimes they would linger, interlacing naturally as if our bodies remembered a closeness that had existed long before words confirmed it. Even the quiet silences were comfortable, filled with a sense of being truly seen, truly understood. I noticed the little things, the way her hair fell softly across her shoulders in the morning light, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed at something small and ordinary, the way her hand found mine when she wanted reassurance or connection. Each gesture was meaningful, tender, and entirely without pretense. There was no need for force or urgency. The intimacy we had cultivated was steady, deep, and profoundly human. We would often sit together in the evening, leaning slightly toward each other on the couch, talking quietly about the day, sharing thoughts that we hadn't shared with anyone else. Sometimes it was serious, sometimes playful, but always there was an underlying current of trust, of safety, of a connection that transcended the initial tension and attraction. I felt her presence not only beside me, but within me, an anchoring warmth that made ordinary life feel richer, fuller, more vivid. Even in moments apart, the connection lingered. A message, a glance across a crowded room, a subtle smile in passing. Each one was a reminder that the bond we had formed was enduring. The age difference, which had once felt like a looming shadow, now seemed irrelevant, softened by mutual respect, understanding, and the quiet patience we had extended to each other. There was also a sense of playfulness, a gentle teasing that made our growing closeness feel natural. A brush of her hand as she passed me, a soft laugh when I overthought something, a teasing comment about my nervousness. These moments were small but loaded with affection, showing that our connection was both profound and human, tender yet alive with joy. By the end, it felt as if we had arrived at a new, steady place together. There was no rush, no urgency, only the quiet fulfillment of two people who had navigated hesitation, fear, and longing to discover a connection that was both emotionally deep and genuinely comforting. Sitting together, hand in hand, I felt the subtle warmth of her presence, the gentle steadiness of her heartbeat as she leaned slightly against me. And in that simple, unassuming intimacy, I realized that this was the true reward of patience, vulnerability, and trust, a connection that was enduring, tender, and entirely ours. The story ended not with fireworks, but with quiet completeness, a gentle, human love that had been waiting all along, revealed in glances, touches, and the steady rhythm of hearts finally allowed to speak.